Okay, we will start. My name's Jacquelynne Willcox and I'm Chair of the Sydney Institute, and welcome to those of you in the room here tonight and those joining us online. You would have got an email, those of you joining us via Zoom, you would have got an email about how you can send through your questions. And also to those who are joining us via Sky News. So I'm going to be the Chief Wrangler tonight, and with the people who will be speaking, as you know, are obviously our Executive Director, Gerard Henderson, and who was a student of Dr. Knopfelmacher, and Michael Easson, who, as many of you know, is a former trade unionist, former Vice President of the New South Wales Labor Party, businessman and board member and great friend of the Sydney Institute. Michael will speak first. We've also got Frank's one of Frank's books here tonight, and it's also available online, so that's my little plug from the Sydney Institute. And for those of you here tonight, Anne is actually doing her normal wonderful things and selling them outside. So before Michael starts, Gerard has asked me just to give a bit of a brief on Frank Knopfelmacher for those of you who hadn't seen the invitation with the background, and particularly those who are watching on Sky. So Michael and Gerard are going to go into great detail, much more detail than I, about the period when Dr. Knopfelmacher was at Melbourne University and he made a name for himself as quite a strident and fierce anti-communist. But for those of you who've read it, please forgive me, just as I refresh you, that Gerard, as I said, was a student of Frank Knopfelmacher at the University of Melbourne, and that's where his lectures in social and political theory were attended by many notable public intellectuals. But he studied psychology, philosophy and English at both Charles University in Prague and the Bristol and London universities in the UK. He fled Czechoslovakia twice, the first showing great foresight as a Czech Jew when the Nazis marched in 1939. He headed off to Palestine, where he worked on a kibbutz, was a policeman in Haifa, became a very committed communist, and he was also a great Czech patriot, and he joined the Czech army in exile in Palestine, and of course they were linked naturally with the British Army, and he served in that role in North Africa and then rather bravely again in Normandy. He married his wife in London, and at the end of the Second World War they both elected to go back to Czechoslovakia, where they discovered that both of their families, all their siblings and their parents and many other members of their family had been murdered in the Holocaust. He studied then at Charles University, in Prague, and he talked then about the great political university that he was able to watch communism in what he called laboratory-like conditions, and he famously predicted the communist takeover of Czechoslovakia in 1948, which prompted him to leave his country for the second time, and he also left communism. He then became an academic at Melbourne University, and this is the dynamic period that Gerard and Anne both knew him well and helped organise many of his speeches and were clearly great friends of his. His fierce anti-communism prompted him to be denied a place at Sydney University. Many of you will remember that period, and that is the period that no doubt Gerard and Michael will explore tonight. So I'm going to ask Michael, please, to speak first. Michael Easson, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacquelynne. I have a case of imposter syndrome tonight because I was asked a week ago, could you turn up to the launch I'm doing at Gerard Henderson's office of this book? That call came from Michael Danby, and later that day I discovered he'd been double booked, and then I got a call from Anne saying, could you do it? So here I am. Frank Knopfelmacher is someone I heard about and thought about as a young man. And when I thought about coming along tonight, my brother Shane said, he is part of our youth. And I remember clipping out all of the articles he published in the Nation Review And, and that was a political education for me. And I remember giving this valuable archive to a friend of mine who within a few weeks was in an argument and a very difficult divorce. And I never wondered, I wondered when should I get back this valuable archive, and I never did. So I feel it's a great loss. But I was fascinated by Knopfelmacher, partly from doing political science and philosophy at the University of New South Wales, and people like Donald Horne and Doug McCallum and other people of that vintage, and Owen Harry spoke very much about the man. And I remember meeting him. He came over to our place, to Mary and my place on one occasion, and I have no memory of what was said or who else was there at that particular night, but I do recall two great lines of Knopfels. One of them was about Geoffrey Blainey, who launched the book last week in Melbourne, and he was saying, I've been thinking about Blainey, he's not really a racist. Have you been to Ballarat? And at that time I'd not been to Ballarat, and he said, if you go there, that's the old Australia, that's what Blainey identifies with, and so if you go to Ballarat you can understand the rest of what he's saying. So I thought that was interesting. And the other line that he used was politics. It requires two hands. Sometimes the hand of friendship, and on other times, as you're extending the hand, you need to hold your stomach in. And Knopfels, Franta, as he was known to his friends and enemies alike, was a person who had the gift of the gab and a very serious message to impart. And I remember some great lines from those Nation Review articles which still stick in my memory, even though I've not been able to recover that archive. But I remember a reference to Manning Clark, who wrote a book, Meeting Soviet Man. And Knopfels wrote in his article, he met Soviet man and did not find him wanting, which was a marvellous expression at that moment. He also had a great line about Germany getting its revenge on the United States for 2 World War defeats in a row by exporting Bauhaus architects in their thousands. On another occasion, I remember hearing from one of my colleagues in the Cronulla branch of the Labor Party about this interesting intellectual, Frank Knopfelmacher, and he said there was this moment when he was debating the Vietnam War, and his great bête noire was Professor Frederick May of the University of Sydney, Professor of Italian. And May was one of his great antagonists when Knopfelmacher sought a position as a senior lecturer in political theory at the University of Sydney. And May led an opposition of the academics at Sydney University, even though he'd been appointed to this position. It was overturned by the professorial board and eventually the Senate, even though the Department of Government intended to employ him. And debating Frederick May on television, Knopfelmacher said, and if I can reply to the Professor of Double Dutch at the University of Sydney, and it went on like that. Now that gives you a glimpse of this dynamic personality who maybe created 1 or 2 enemies along the way. I found it interesting doing a little bit of research before coming here about that controversy in 1965, and I was astonished by the turmoil that it caused at the University of Sydney and elsewhere. He was a big name. Knopfelmacher was a headline in the papers in Sydney at that time. And why was he interesting? I think I recently was involved in the publication of this book of Owen Harry's essays, and he wrote about his political education, and in this book there's a great piece by Knopfel on his own development. And Owen Harry's coming to Australia as a Fabian socialist found it an interesting country. He wondered whether it might be a bit provincial and boring, but he discovered in the early 1950s the politics was strange and harsh, involving Catholics and communists as major actors in a way that was more European than British. And when I read that piece by Owen, I thought immediately of people like Richard Krieger, who was the publisher of Quadrant, and Knopfelmacher. They were lively, interesting, and they were witnesses to the catastrophe of Europe in the 20th century with communism and Nazism. And Knopfelmacher significantly, towards the end of his life, said, "What have you achieved?" The person asked him. And he said, who knows? And he thought, but I educated a generation, a whole generation. If I have a lasting achievement, it is that. And I hope that was true, because today we face new battles and new controversies, and I damn well wish that there is a Knopfelmacher on the TV screen, on the radio, and in print, expressing his opposition to the kind of stuff that we're now seeing with the rise of anti-Semitism, especially, and the brutal hatred of sensible academic teaching of the canon of Western civilization. And he had a great phrase in one of his articles that he believed that it was important to teach his students that there was no connection between communist concentration camps and the theories and positions of John Stuart Mill on liberty. And conveying that kind of understanding is a battle which we fight throughout our lives. But coming back to 1965, I was astonished to read this bad, soiled attacks on Knopfelmacher that were put out on the line in various articles at the time. And Professor May, along with other people, claimed that he wasn't smart enough, that he was slow on his feet, he didn't footnote his articles adequately. He described one article that was published in Henry Mayer's publication on the Catholic Church and totalitarianism. Frederick May, Professor of Italian, commenting on someone proposing to be a senior lecturer in political theory, he said, "It is very brief, all but undocumented, and gives large asseveration in a field where close and elaborately supported argument is called for." And so this is May, no expert in this field that Knopfelmacher is involved in, making those criticisms. And Knopfelmacher returned to the fray, as you might imagine he would. And he wrote a letter in response to Frederick May, and he said, "I've never claimed to be the sort of chap who writes papers on 3 neglected letters of Edmund Burke, and I'm not likely to become one." And he said, it seems that Professor May believes that footnotes are a necessary condition of fertility in political philosophy. And Knopfelmacher was a wonderful debater. And in this book, we see collected some of his great essays, including My Political Education, and for me the most significant and interesting essay of them all is The Consequences of Israel, that was published in Quadrant in November 1967. You could imagine him writing it very soon after the Six-Day War in June, and then getting it published. And I found this particular article incredible because he made predictions as to what the consequences of the win would be. And he wrote that there would be changes in Jewish political alignment as the left changed their mind on Israel and the Jewish people. For the gentlemen of the right, he wrote, there is nothing to despise among the farmers and soldiers of Israel. Military colleges all over the world will be honoured if General Dayan attends. And he predicted that the left would no longer see the pathetic wandering Jew as part of their alignment, but they would see the tough-minded Israel as a party that they would abandon. He couldn't help it, but Knopfelmacher, whenever given a choice between being deadly accurate and being memorable, never hesitated. So in that article, he had another great line, which was that the Russians must be feeling despair about all that military equipment that they lent and gave and financed to the Egyptians and the other Arab army. It was like giving bicycles to kangaroos. On another occasion, he wrote about Norman Podhoretz, who wrote a truly dreadful memoir when he was young called Making It. And he wrote a better memoir about the changes in his political alignment as he moved more to the right in the 1970s. And he had this great line broadly praising Podhoretz, but he said about this book called Breaking Ranks, he said he could not really break ranks because he never marched. He just hung around on the sidewalk, vaguely cheering or booing as the fashion of the day indicated. Gosh, that was worth reading. I also think that there is an incredible, important message to apply about this man who had the kindly appearance of an old music teacher and the manner of a tough politician. He was controversial, admired and hated, partly because of his anti-communism, but more particularly his effective anti-communism. Before he applied to the University of Sydney role, which was rejected, as I mentioned, he'd reached the end of his salary scale as a lecturer in Melbourne and was never promoted. And in a review of a book published by Sidney Hawke, one of the great philosophers, the head of the philosophy department at New York University, Knopfelmacher made the point that this man had sacrificed a lot of his life trying to educate the young in proper ways. And that was also a statement that could be made about him. Knopfelmacher, in the last essay published in this book, made this comment about himself. A near miraculous survivor, now of declining years, past 70, he has only one remaining duty: to warn. He made some fantastic statements in the 1970s about the refugees from Indochina. He talked about Australia's obligation, having fought in the Vietnam War, not to allow those refugees to drown like rats. He believed we had a moral obligation, and he wanted to warn us about the nature of the threat that the country faced and the nature of the totalitarian countries that had emerged in Southeast Asia, but he wanted to remind us about our moral obligation. One of his other fantastic notes was about Cambodian refugees, stories about the Thais sending them back and how Australia had an obligation to reach out and find and rehabilitate those people. So Knopfelmacher is a person I heard about, I eventually got to meet. I read pretty well everything he wrote, and what a fantastic person to honour tonight, and I congratulate the family on putting together this book and giving us all a reminder of who he was and a prod to think harder about the challenges we face and what he might have said if he were now amongst us. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. I will now lower the microphone, as I've been instructed to do, to my dear friend and our Executive Director, Gerard Henderson. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacquelynne, and thanks, Michael, for a very amusing and important speech. I'll just make a couple of brief comments on what Michael said. I was at Melbourne University in 1967 when the debate on the Six-Day War took place. And Knopfelmacher was one of three on one side, and there were three on the other side. And Knopfelmacher, I'll come to what he said in a minute. I mean, at that stage, in 67, the left at the university and also was very supportive of Israel, but as Knopfelmacher predicted, as Michael points out, he always said that if Israel won, or when Israel won that war, the left would turn against them. And by the time we got to Yom Kippur in 1973, that's exactly what happened, and it's just even worse today. But in that debate, I remember Knopfelmacher saying that he spoke about the Schieffelin plan of the German High Command in the First World War in 1914, which was aimed on a sudden attack on various fronts around the back and taking Paris and the other cities from behind. And he said it was an absolutely brilliant strategy. He said there's one mistake that the German High Command made in 1914, which was for the Schieffelin plan to work, you had to be fighting the Egyptian army, which brought the house down. I've never forgotten it. Now, I want to thank Andrew Knopfelmacher, who's on the Zoom tonight, down in Melbourne, for putting this together, this fine volume of his father's selected writings between 58 and 1993, and to Sue Knopfelmacher, Andrew's mother, and Frank's widow, whom he married in 1970 after the death of his first wife, for supporting the work. And to Anthony Capello, the publisher at Connor Court in Brisbane. Without Connor Court, many successful authors would be cancelled by the leftist orthodoxy which pervades much of the publishing profession today. Now, I first met Frank Knopfelmacher at the University of Melbourne in the mid-60s. I was not actually one of his students in a class. And I should also say about Frank, there's only one point I should correct about Michael's, that he ended up a reader at Melbourne University, which I think is the equivalent of an associate professor these days. But his promotions were unfairly delayed for many, many years. Now, I first met him, I was not one of his students in a class. I studied arts, majored in what was called political science and law, and Franta, as we called him, as the English translation of his Czech name, was a lecturer in the Department of Psychology. However, as Andrew points out in his preface, Franta regarded philosophy and social theory as being his great intellectual loves, rather than being a mere academic psychologist. He described his family as Czech, German, Jewish bourgeoisie, and he wrote in 1974, and it's in this chapter, in this book, this fine book that we're talking about tonight, Frank Knopfelmacher, Selective Writings. He wrote, I believe with the Pope that man lives in a vale of tears, and with Max Weber that to engage in politics effectively presupposes inevitability to compromise with evil forces. And he added, now, the first reference is to the Valley of Tears, which embraced the teaching of the Catholic Church about the fall and the consequences and imperfectibility of mankind. The second is the German sociologist Max Weber, who supported the concept of an ethic of responsibility rather than an ethic of ultimate ends. The former stressed the need to coalition, the latter embraced ideology. Now, like all of us, Franta was affected by the fall. At times he was obsessive and grumpy, but always clever. A man of high intelligence, he had a biting wit and a great sense of irony, and was learned across several disciplines. Sure, he had many disagreements with his friends and associates, as well as with his enemies. Not all of them were mended, but not all of them were his own fault. However, on occasions he did have a problem in finding the correct tone in the public debate, which made him all the more interesting, I must say. I'm pleased to report that I never fell out with Knopfelmacher, and I always admired him, even though as a young student and later academic, it was difficult at times to handle all his late night phone calls, which often, I don't exaggerate, came through 5, 6, 7 times a night. And after the first one, they did continue to you pick up the phone, and he was saying, "As I was saying, Jody, you know," and then it would come again and again. But I wasn't the only one. I think in between, he was ringing other people pretty well. That's true. It was difficult to handle. We disagreed on some issues, but what was particularly attractive about Knopfelmacher was his intellectual courage and his emphatic opposition to totalitarianism of the Nazi, fascist and communist varieties. And Jacquelynne's traced a bit of his history in Czechoslovakia. And she mentioned that he predicted the Holocaust. She mentioned he predicted the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. He also predicted the Holocaust, which is why he got out. And he wrote in 1957, and it's in the book, from 2 decades earlier, he was saddled with the awareness of violence and death, which has never left me, he said. And he added, "Risking boastfulness, I regard this intuitive understanding of the totalitarian mentality as one of my intellectual assets. I think I've never been wrong on anything connected with totalitarianism," and that was right. As I mentioned earlier, I never studied in his classes. However, during my time at Melbourne University, he had a significant influence on my intellectual upbringing and that of many others. I attended, and later with Anne, organised many of his packed-out campus lunchtime talks when I was a member of the DLP club at Melbourne University, and Anne and I, because we couldn't get any money from the student union because we were unfashionable then as we're unfashionable now, we would book the public lecture theatre and then go to Melbourne University at night and then chalk. We would chalk on the asphalt. Lunchtime talk on Thursday, Frank Knopfelmacher on Czechoslovakia. I've never forgotten how to spell Czechoslovakia. I can do it in my dreams. But I did also with Anne, I attended his various lectures, which were very popular at the Council of Adult Education in the Melbourne CBD. So I did go to those. I was his student there. And I found, the other day, I found my handwritten notes from 1968. Dr. Frank Knopfelmacher, 1, Marxism. There we go. And I've got many of these others' handwritten notes. And they read very well, actually, not my handwriting, but what Knopfelmacher's saying about Marxism is, he was quite an admirer of Marx, although a critic, but he was because Marx, of course, had nothing to do with communism, that came later. And the other important influence on me was Hugo Wolfson, a Berlin Jew who fled Germany shortly before the Second World War commenced, and the extra university influences Bob Santa Maria, the Catholic anti-communist activist, and Knopfelmacher knew all men well, or these two men well. And what this trio had in common was their anti-communism as a manifestation of anti-totalitarianism. Like Knopfelmacher, Santa Maria also had an occasional problem with tone, but he too was interesting. And Knopfelmacher had flirted with communism as a young man, as Jacquelynne points out, and that gave him all the more authority to talk about it later. Not long after I met Knopfelmacher, he was involved in the controversy following the publication of his essay, in which I found the other day at home, The Situation at the University of Melbourne in the autumn 1964 edition of the Quarterly Review, 20th Century, and that's it there. It's chapter 6 in this volume that Andrew's put together, and it was preceded by the essay The Threat to Academic Freedom, which was published in Quadrant magazine in autumn 1958. Now, as Jacquelynne points out, Knopfelmacher arrives in Melbourne in 1955 to take up an appointment in the Department of the Psychology Department of Melbourne University. And both essays focused on the influence of the Communist Party of Australia on Melbourne University. We now know that there were communist cells there. Knopfelmacher said this. He was laughed at, but he was right. But he tackled the matter with his devastating prose, and he wrote in 20th Century, for an Australian academic to sympathise with such a Stalinist movement as communism must surely seem either a symptom of intellectual incompetence or moral depravity. And that was correct, but it was unfashionable, and it was harsh. And towards the end of the essay, he said, like rats, they, the university left, wish to operate in the dark, which was also quite strong. But the fact is the communists did operate underground, so to speak. And so it happened, he applied for a senior lectureship in political philosophy at Sydney University in late 64. In early 65, his appointment was recommended by a selection committee in a vote of 3-0 with one abstention, which was a left-wing academic who wasn't in the field of political philosophy. However, as Michael was pointing out, in an improper intervention, the appointment was overturned by the professorial board, and this decision was upheld by the University Senate. This despite the fact that Knopfelmacher had as his referees Professor David Armstrong, Sydney, Professor Boyce Gibson, Melbourne, Professor S. Kroner, Bristol, and Professor Sidney Hook, New York University, all highly regarded philosophers. Armstrong himself is probably Australia's most famous philosopher. Knopfelmacher had been rejected, it was very clear, on account of his political views. Michael Easson mentioned Professor May. His appointment was also attacked at the professorial board by Professor Christensen, an electrical engineer, who cited France's 20th century article as a reason why he should not be appointed to an academic position, thus proving Knopfelmacher's point, which he'd written in these essays, that the real opponents of academic freedom in Australia were not the right, the real opponents were the left. However, to be fair, a few left-wing intellectuals spoke up against the Sydney University deplatforming, in modern parlance, of Knopfelmacher. For example, Stephen Murray Smith, the editor of the Overland magazine in Melbourne. And writing in Quadrant in June 65, Donald Horne conceded that the article was highly cantankerous, but he maintained that Knopfelmacher was entitled to be cantankerous, and added that to ban him made him, Horne, blush for the provincialism of some Sydney professors who couldn't stand up to a bloke from Central Europe who was lively and interesting. From 55 till his retirement in 89 at the age of 65, Knopfelmacher engaged the Australian left in debate. He published only one book, which is Intellectuals and Politics by Frank Knopfelmacher. You see the eyes there. Henry Mayer at Sydney University was a friend of Knopfelmacher. He said what was striking about the book is that it looked the same whether you had it up that way or the other way. Because the eye was another version of the eyes have it. Anyway, Franta found that very funny, as did I. But he also wrote numerous high-quality essays and journals and articles in such newspapers as The Age, and in such newspapers as The Age, Sydney Morning Herald, The Australian, and of course Nation Review, which he then, as I recall, was edited by Richard Walsh, a left-wing magazine, but they asked Knopfelmacher to contribute. You don't find that at the ABC today, they're a conservative free zone. But Richard Walsh managed to put Knopfelmacher in Nation Review and led to the collection which Michael had and which he lost due to a marriage breakup of someone other than himself, which is a most unusual marriage breakup that causes you to lose Knopfelmacher's articles in Nation Review, but there you go. Now, above all, he was a brilliant teacher and an accomplished polemicist. The latter gift was something of a rarity in the essential Anglo-Celtic Australia at the time. I think that made Santa Maria different too, because his background was Italian. Novels of Central European. People like Henry Mayer, they were different. Hugo Wolfson, they were people that most Australians hadn't seen, and that's why I remember them all well from university, because they made an impact. Now, in his quadrant essay, My Political Education, which Michael's quoted, and it's in here, he reflected that he was brought up in a place permeated with Catholicism and Catholic imagery, architecture, and ways a part of my personality makeup, he said. He added, today most of my best friends, he used that term, my best friends, most of my best friends, which was a common term used. He used that in inverted commas. He said, most of my best friends are Catholic, and he wrote that he found very soon after arriving in Australia that the people who understood what I was talking about, he named Bob Santa Maria, Jim Macaulay, Vincent Buckley, and who sympathised with my political position here in Australia, were not left-wingers and liberals, but Catholics. However, Knopfelmacher wrote that he was nauseated by so-called Catholic progressives in the university. He had in mind the likes of Max Charlesworth, who some of us remember well. He wrote, Catholic progressives and Catholic fellow travellers, sort of ones who sucked up to the communists, he thought he'd give me the croops. He said, I prefer William McMahon Balls of this world without incense and holy water. McMahon Ball was a professor at Melbourne University, a nice guy, a soft lefty, but a nice sort of soft lefty. And he occasionally picked me up when I was a student at the bus stop waiting to go to university and drove me in. In those days you had to read your essays because typewriters weren't around and I didn't type anyway, and you had to read it. And McMarble was a really nice guy, so I had to write something, and he called me into his room and, Mr. Henderson, sit down, and how was the car trip today? And then he said, look, just read it out. And I got halfway through it. It was about probably 3,000 words. I got halfway through it, and he said, look, I think we should stop there, Mr. Henderson. We'll get a cup of tea. And he called his secretary in, and she got a cup of tea. And then we went back, and I read the rest, and he said, a fine essay, Mr. Henderson. I'd have one criticism. I said, what's that, Professor? He said, look, it's a bit disjointed in the middle, he said. But he was a nice guy, and he had a great car. He famously said at the Monash debate on Vietnam in 1965, which I attended, that he didn't know much about Asia, but he had been reading the English translation of Japanese dailies, he said, which I was impressed about, except that when I did another course with him later, he said he didn't know much about Europe, but he had been reading the English translation of German newspapers. So anyway, he was a nice guy, and better than Max Charlesworth. For his part, Santa Maria commented that he learned to understand the essence of totalitarianism by speaking to and reading Frank, and the quote's on the back of this book. And when a young man, Santa Maria's anti-communism was influenced by Pius XI's 1937 papal encyclical Divini Redemptoris, which translated means on atheistic communism. And I remember well an early conversation with Franta when he said to me that this was the wrong approach to communism. The problem with communism, he said, was not that it was atheistic, but that it was totalitarian. This message had an impact on Santa Maria and many other anti-communist Catholics at the time. And of course, he urged all of us to read Arthur Koestler and George Orwell, who had influenced him, as pointed out in this book, and as made clear in chapter 1 of the book. He also had an influence on Jewish students by talking about the Slansky trials in Czechoslovakia in 1952 and Stalin's doctor's plot in the Soviet Union in 1953 to make the point that communism was not only totalitarian but also anti-Semitic. And he made that point, and that was important there. In the early 1960s, Knopfelmacher's anti-communism was intellectually unfashionable at a time when many preached the need for dialogue and détente with Moscow. This somewhat changed when the Soviet Union crushed the Prague Spring in Czechoslovakia in 1968. Knopfelmacher predicted that Brezhnev's regime would do precisely this. It was an unfashionable position at the time, and he was ridiculed at Melbourne University until it happened. And a year earlier, as Michael had pointed out, in the Six-Day War, had ensured that his support for the State of Israel became manifest, that it should exist within secure borders. Before that, he had a somewhat ambiguous relationship with the State of Israel. That all changed then. It's important to remember that Franta was a lifetime academic, but one who did not try hard to cultivate academic friends on campus. He had this to say about some of his colleagues. He described the professional intellectual as not one who knows more about an academic subject than an amateur, but one who is familiar with the daily chores, swindles, arm twisting and gimmicks on the low and middle levels of the academic workplace. And he had this to say about the political science departments, and along with sociology and psychology, but he put political science, he put the science in inverted commas. He had this to say about political science department. He said, they were not arenas of titanic intellectual struggles, he said, but rather strange bazaars without real trade, in which incessant haggling for carpets, secretaries, gadgets, trips, leaves is taking place. And this reminds me of my 3 years in the political science in inverted commas department at La Trobe University, where Colin Rubenstein and myself supported Professor Hugo Wolfson and Professor Joan Ryden as they attempted to resist the carpet hagglers, whose incessant demands was for minutes to be kept at the senseless staff meetings which they insisted on having. Those were terrible times. And Now, it's the practice of, I'll finish shortly, it's the practice of Australian Dictionary of Biography to put the name of the authors at the end of their entries, so that readers learn about the dead before discovering the identity of the author, usually living, who wrote them. Now, when the online edition of Volume 19 came out in 2020, I noted the penultimate paragraph of the somewhat critical entry on Frank Knopfelmacher read as follows. Among those influenced by Knopfelmacher were the politician Michael Danby, who could have been here tonight if he hadn't double booked, the publicist Gerard Henderson, the journalist Greg Sheridan, the ideology maker Ray Evans. Peter Costello launched this book in Melbourne last Tuesday, and he said, "What would happen if Ray went to the airport and the person at the United States said, what do you do?" And Ray would have to say, "Oh, I make ideologies." The legal, and then the legal academic, oh, that's nice, Martin Krieger, the philosopher, Raymond Gator, and the political historian and public intellectual, Robert Mann. And I was delighted to be named. Sure, I don't have the status of a public intellectual, but the fact is that an ageing anti-communist scribbler bloke like me has been hailed as a publicist, along the lines of that sassy Sydney socialite publicist Roxy Janenko, was a morale booster for me. I'd never been compared with Roxy before. And I raised this with the Dictionary of Biography, and they said, but Mr. Mann insists that nothing will change. And I said, well, they said, that's the rules. But you correct your mistakes, I said. But at any rate, I left it at that. Now, at the final paragraph, I checked out the name of the author of the, and as you probably anticipated, it was Robert Mann, who described himself as the public intellectual Robert Mann. Wow. And now this was the kind of academic self-regard of the left intelligentsia which Franta absolutely delighted in mocking. And wherever he is tonight, I'm sure if he looks down on that, he would find it most amusing. Now, for the record, in his obituary in The Australian on the 19th of May 1993, the writer Gideon Haigh mentioned those who he said had been brushed by the teaching of Frank Knopfelmacher, and he concluded, myself, Gerard Henderson, in this order. It was Gerard Henderson, Peter Costello, which is true, B.A. Santa Maria, Robert Mann, Patrick Morgan, who had a bit to do with this book, that's also true, Sam Lipsky and Izzy Liebler. Lipsky and Liebler are Jewish, and Mann too, but the others are not. He added that Knopfelmacher later brushed off some of them, which is also true. Now, in conclusion, I repeat an earlier comment. What stands out in Frank Knopfelmacher selected writings is Franta's intellectual courage in supporting unfashionable but just causes, from opposition to communism, including the Ho Chi Minh kind in Vietnam, to support for Israel. This entailed that he stood against many of his academic superiors. He was never made a full professor, but he did get to what would be an associate professor, and many university vice-chancellors who, like today, he regarded as exhibiting weakness in failing to stand up against left-wing academics and left-wing students who are opposed to open debate. Andrew Knopfelmacher's collection provides another reason why Franta will be remembered when most of his antagonists are long forgotten and his admirers remain admirers, whether living in their memoirs and accounts of the time. So many thanks tonight.
Question here.
Could I ask both of the fine voices that we've heard tonight, it's been a fascinating account. When you think of what Bob Hawke had to say about Israel and the failure of Israel, in the words that he said very eloquently and briefly, was that if Israel was to fail, that would be a disaster for the West as a whole. I'd be interested in both your views on that situation in the current environment where we are not hearing the same sort of support of what I've just said from the government.
Well, I'll be very brief. Certainly from the 67 on, Knopfelmacher was a strong supporter of Israel and always spoke out. And for the reason you suggest, it wasn't just a matter of Israel, it was a matter of the West. And we don't have very many people of great courage these days. There are a lot of people. I saw Dershowitz saying on Fox News the other night in the United States that he's upset that Harvard University some of the academics in the law school there are supporting the demonstrators. But he said a number of the people from the major law universities ring him up, he's now in retirement, or emeritus professor, and say they agree with him, but they won't say it publicly because they're worried that they'll be discriminated against on campus. So a lot of people have got their own commitments and whatever, and you can understand why some people won't say publicly what they are willing to say privately. Michael.
Look, I agree with the premise of the question that the defence and the continuation of the Jewish state is important for the West and for all of us. So I think that Frank Knopfelmacher was a very strong voice from 1967 onwards. I do think that Australia is better than the United States, it seems, and with the university campuses there, Harvard and so on and so forth, but not tremendously wonderful. I mean, we have a professor of government at the University of Sydney who put on his Twitter account or the X account the flags of Hamas on the 8th of October. We have a lecturer at the Macquarie University who published on her Twitter account and other parts of social media that there should be no safe places at universities for Zionists. And that worries me enormously, that there is a lack of bravery by the university administration. There's a line here that Knopfelmacher uses that when controversies arose in the 1960s, the administrators looked on impartially. And it seems that today we have a lot of administrators who aren't prepared to tackle the question of anti-Semitism and the madness that we see on university campuses, even in Australia.
We have a question down the front here.
Hello, Michaela Browning, and can I say thank you to both of the speakers. But I remember Franta as a next generation student of Franta, and he used to come out to Monash University where some of us were studying, and we'd organise for him to come and speak. And even at that stage, so we're talking about the 80s, he was courageous because there would be people that would come and heckle him and other sorts of things, and he would be prepared to stand up and talk about things that I don't think a number of people are prepared to speak with that sort of courage, particularly on campuses today. But he was very happy to engage with people who had different opinions to what he did, and I think that was we saw the value in somebody like that coming and speaking on campus. So I want to say that personally. But my question, and it goes to something that you mentioned, Michael, because I think it's important, and it goes to some of the work you're doing on the Centre of Western Civilization, is that he would also spend a lot of his time with adult education and doing a lot of engagement with young people or adults, formally or informally, just to talk about Marx, Weber and political philosophy in great detail. And he was quite an expert on that, and he loved teaching that. And we've seen a sort of diminishing of people who, have got a lot of that expertise. And I think that there's a legacy there, and I wondered what you make of that lasting legacy and who is there to take that forward now.
Well, you wonder whether there is a legacy, because I think every generation has to renew itself and to battle the battles that Gerard was involved in, I was involved in at the universities as well, and Knopfelmacher obviously was. I'm involved in the board of the Centre for Western Civilization, and we're trying to do our bit at the University of Queensland, at Wollongong, at the ACU, to develop a new generation. But you mentioned adult education, and I despair at organisations like the adult education movement at Melbourne, the WEA, the Workers' Education Association here, and the training of young people at universities in nighttime. which used to be a feature of all of the universities. Now it doesn't almost happen. And I think that there's a lot of people, including those who've gone through university, who've not had exposure to Weber or Marx or other theory, who would really be interested in learning about this. So I think that the university sector has, in becoming more professionalised, it's not having the ethic of responsibility about reaching out beyond the hours that you have to teach and lecture. So I think that's a great challenge, and I hope we at the Centre for Western Civilisation can do our little bit to help that.
There's a question over here.
Yeah.
Isn't the situation that's described today just the crowning evidence of the success of the Long March through the institutions?
Well, the left have been, the mad left have been influential for a long time. And one thing relevant, I think, to Michaela's question and yours is that Knopfelmacher understood why people would become communists. He was for a period of time. He had the great fortune when he was serving in the Czech division of the British Army in Normandy, standing guard on a building. He looked over and he saw this interesting book, and he read it while he was on guard duty, Darkness at Noon by Arthur Koestler, which was a great novel, and it was a revelation for him about how the Soviet Union worked. And that was a moment, amongst others, when the penny dropped about the system. So we can't give up on anyone, and I certainly believe that the younger people today who've got no understanding of the Holocaust, of the Cold War, you talk to my children about some of the things I got up to, they think I must be inventing it. So, Gerard.
I'll just make a brief comment. The left was very strong in the 60s, from the mid-60s on, but I think I agree with the question. It's much stronger now in the social sciences and among academics and students. But it was strong then, but I think it's stronger now.
Do we have any more questions? At the back. Sorry, I can't get one in myself.
Both speakers mentioned an enviable reputation for correct prediction on certain events in the Middle East and in Europe. Did he engage with government ministers at any stage? He lived through Menzies, I guess, Fraser, Hawke administrations.
Gerard would know more than I do about this, but Knopfelmacher moved from being the communist he was in Czechoslovakia. His eyes were open, and he called himself a liberal progressive at one point, and then he, in a profile in the 1960s when all this controversy broke about his appointment, he described himself as a Gatescalite social democrat, a reference to the British Labour Prime Minister. Look, I think he was very influential with Michael Danby, with Peter Costello. He did engage with Malcolm Fraser, and I know he did so in the context of debates on multiculturalism. He was more sceptical about that than Fraser was. But I'm not sure. But Gerard, you would know better.
No, I think that's a good summary. He was discussed in Parliament because the Sydney University Senate decision to bar him from the position, that was discussed in Parliament. It was drawn to the attention of Prime Minister Menzies. We know that from documents. But I don't think he focused more on students, and particularly young students. And I think Michael does point out, Peter Costello became Federal Treasurer. Michael Danby became a Labor frontbencher in government. And they used to go around to Knopfelmacher's place in Elsterwick at night. Many of us did. I remember Anne and I used to go around, and Knopfelmacher always said he was a great threat expert, which he was. And he turned out to be, his threats turned out to be essentially correct, but you'd have a long conversation. Everyone was quite sober, and you'd talk about this and there was darkness all pervading and everything was going bad and things were bad and would invariably get worse. And then Nan and I would walk out of a night and Elsternwick in winter time and the moon was up and the breeze was blowing off Port Phillip Bay, and you sort of wondered whether the world out there was the same as the world in here. But the world in here, he influenced a lot of people, and Costello and Danby are two of them.
One more question?
Thank you. That was terrific. I'd actually never heard of Frank before, so I'm now going to buy the book. What would he have said to the old argument that communism is fantastic, it's just that the wrong people get in charge?
I think he'd have a view that that's not the right thinking, meaning that the people in charge was the problem with communism, which is why he drew a distinction between Marx and what followed in the Soviet Union with all its barbarism, etc. He did describe in one, and it's referred to in one of his essays, Marxism, Leninism, cannibalism, a reference to Cambodia.
Thank you all for being here and for being inspirational. I commend the book to you. For those of you who are here, there are books outside. Those of you who are online, you can also find the books on the Sydney Institute website. Thank you all for coming along tonight, and we'll see you soon.